I worked 40 years for my lake house. 40 years of early mornings and late nights so I could finally sit on my own porch and watch the sun sink into the water in peace. But one Sunday evening, my daughter-in-law smiled across my dinner table and announced that her parents would be moving into it, permanently. She said it like it was already settled, like my home belonged to her. She didn't expect me to show her exactly where the door was. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube. I bought that lake house 2 years before I retired. I still remember the first time I stood on the dock and watched the water ripple under the morning light. It wasn't the biggest house on the lake, and it certainly wasn't the most modern, but it was mine. Every plank of that wooden porch felt like proof that my sacrifices had meant something. I was a nurse for 38 years. Night shifts, holidays, missed birthdays. I packed school lunches half asleep and learned to function on 4 hours of rest. I did it alone after my husband passed when my son, Daniel, was only 12. There were nights I would sit at the kitchen table after Daniel went to bed and cry quietly, wondering if I could keep going. But I did. For him. Always for him. The lake house wasn't just property. It was peace. It was the promise I made to myself that one day, after I'd given everything to everyone else, I would finally breathe. Daniel was proud when I bought it. He helped me move in. He even joked that he'd be visiting every weekend once I retired. "Free vacation spot," he'd say, laughing. I didn't mind. I loved the idea of family dinners on the deck, grandchildren running along the shoreline someday. The house was big enough for visits, but it was never meant to be shared permanently. Then Daniel met Chloe. Chloe was charming the first time I met her, polished, confident. She wore expensive perfume and spoke about investments and long-term positioning like she was giving a business presentation. I tried to remind myself that she came from a different background. Her parents had always struggled financially. Chloe often mentioned how hard things had been growing up, and I respected that kind of resilience. But there were small moments that made me uneasy. The first was during their engagement dinner. She walked through my lake house slowly, trailing her fingers along the banister. "This place has so much potential," she said. "With the right renovations, it could double in value." I smiled politely. I didn't buy it as an investment. She laughed lightly. "Everything is an investment." I let it go. Young people see the world differently, I told myself. After they married, Daniel changed in subtle ways. He became quieter around me, more cautious. If I offered advice, he'd glance at Chloe before responding. She wasn't openly rude. She was strategic. Conversations with her felt like negotiations I didn't realize I had entered. They rented a small apartment in the city. Chloe worked in marketing. Daniel had recently started a new position at a tech company. They were comfortable, though not extravagant. But Chloe's parents were not doing well. Her father had lost his job years ago. Her mother had medical issues. Their home was small and aging. I sympathized. I truly did. Still, sympathy has limits. The Sunday it happened, I had invited them for dinner at the lake house. I made roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and lemon pie, Daniel's favorite since childhood. The evening started normally. We ate on the deck, the lake was calm, the sky turned soft pink as the sun lowered. Then Chloe set down her fork and folded her hands on the table. "So," she began brightly, "we've been thinking." I felt something shift in my stomach. Daniel cleared his throat but didn't look at me. "My parents' lease is ending next month, and honestly, it's just not safe where they are anymore." I nodded slowly. "That's unfortunate." She smiled. "It is, but we found the perfect solution." Daniel's jaw tightened. "They'll move here." I blinked. Move here. To the lake house, she said, as if clarifying something obvious. There's plenty of space, and you're here alone most of the time. It would actually be good for you, more company. The air felt thin. I'm sorry, I said carefully. I must have misunderstood. Chloe leaned back in her chair. We've already talked to them. They're so excited. It'll be a fresh start. Daniel finally spoke. Mom, it just makes sense financially. You have the room. I stared at my son, the boy I carried through fevers and heartbreak, the young man I worked double shifts for so he could attend college without loans. And when was I consulted? I asked quietly. Chloe's smile faltered just slightly. Well, we assumed you'd want to help family. Assumed. The word echoed in my chest. Daniel rubbed his temples. Mom, it's temporary, until they get back on their feet. How long is temporary? I asked. Silence. Chloe's tone sharpened. We're all family now. It shouldn't be this complicated. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't a request. It was an announcement. She had already decided. I looked around my porch, the wicker chairs I picked out, the wind chimes Daniel bought me for my first retirement birthday, the small potted herbs along the railing, my sanctuary. And which room did you have in mind for them? I asked calmly, misreading my composure. Chloe brightened, misreading my composure. The perfect suite. Downstairs, it's perfect. They saw pictures. They saw pictures? My heart dropped. Daniel avoided my eyes. I folded my napkin and placed it on the table. Chloe, I said softly, this is my home. Yes, and we're just trying to make the most of it. Make the most of it, like it was a resource to be allocated. I didn't argue that night. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood, gathered the dishes, and said, we'll discuss this later. But inside, something had shifted. Because in that single conversation, I understood that my daughter-in-law didn't see my lake house as my retirement sanctuary. She saw it as available real estate, and she truly believed I wouldn't dare say no. I didn't sleep much that night after they left. The lake was unusually still, the surface smooth as glass beneath the moonlight, but my mind would not settle. I sat in my living room with only the small lamp beside the sofa turned on, listening to the old clock tick against the quiet. I kept replaying Chloe's voice in my head. We've already talked to them. They're so excited. Not, we were hoping, not, would you consider. They were excited, as if my consent were a minor detail. I have never been a confrontational woman. Working in hospitals teaches you diplomacy. You learn how to speak gently even when families are panicking. You learn how to steady your voice when delivering news no one wants to hear. But you also learn something else. If you hesitate, people will make decisions for you. By morning, I had clarity. I brewed my coffee and walked out onto the dock. The boards were cool beneath my bare feet. This house had cost me more than money. It had cost decades of discipline. I drove the same car for 15 years. I skipped vacations. I packed leftovers instead of buying lunch at work. Every choice had been deliberate. And now someone wanted to rearrange my life like it was a spare bedroom. Around 10, Daniel called. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice cautious. "Good morning." There was a pause. "About last night." "Yes?" Chloe got a little ahead of herself. "A little?" I waited. "She just worries about her parents. They're not doing great." "I understand that," I said calmly, "but understanding doesn't equal agreement." Another silence. "She feels like you don't like her," he said suddenly. That one stung. "Daniel, this isn't about liking anyone. This is about my home." He exhaled. "It's just, you have so much space." There it was again. Space, as if empty square footage were an invitation. I bought this house for my retirement, not as a communal living arrangement. They wouldn't be in your way. My voice stayed steady. Daniel, I worked 40 years for this piece. His tone shifted slightly, defensive. So what? You'd rather two elderly people struggle than share? That was the first time he tried to make it sound like cruelty. I would rather, I replied gently, not be cornered into decisions about my own property. He didn't answer. Before we hung up, he said something that unsettled me more than anything else. Chloe already told her parents it was happening. Already told them. That afternoon, I received a text from Chloe herself. We're coming by Saturday so Mom and Dad can see their room. Smiley face. Their room. The audacity of that sentence almost made me laugh. Almost. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I walked through my house slowly. The guest suite downstairs had been designed intentionally. A comfortable bed, a reading chair near the window, soft blue curtains. I imagined strangers unpacking their clothes into the dresser drawers, rearranging my shelves, filling the refrigerator with groceries I didn't buy. I imagined not being alone anymore, not in the peaceful way I had envisioned with occasional family visits, but in the suffocating way of permanent intrusion. I thought about my husband. He had always been protective of me. If he were here, he would have handled this swiftly. But I was alone now, and sometimes when you're alone, people assume you are easier to overpower. Saturday arrived faster than I expected. They pulled into my driveway just after noon. Not just Daniel and Chloe. A second car followed. My stomach tightened. Chloe stepped out first, wearing a bright smile and carrying what looked suspiciously like a folder. Daniel followed, his expression unreadable, and from the second car emerged her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, smiling broadly, waving at me like we were celebrating a holiday. I forced a polite expression and walked onto the porch. "Hello," I said evenly. Mrs. Carter hugged me before I could step back. "We can't thank you enough," she gasped. "This is such a blessing." I didn't return the hug fully. "Blessing?" I repeated softly. Chloe clapped her hands together. "Let's show them the suite." Show? Not ask. Show. They began walking toward the front door as if they had done it 100 times before. I remained where I was for a moment, watching. Daniel avoided my eyes again. Inside, they moved through my living room with open curiosity. Mr. Carter examined the fireplace. Mrs. Carter commented on the view. "Oh, we'll sit out here every morning," she gestured toward my favorite chair. We'll. Chloe led them downstairs confidently. "This will be yours," she announced, opening the guest suite door. Mrs. Carter gasped theatrically. "It's perfect." Mr. Carter nodded. "Plenty of space for our things." Their things. I stepped into the doorway. "And who gave you the impression this room was yours?" The room went silent. Chloe turned slowly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said calmly, "this is my guest room." Mrs. Carter looked confused. Chloe said, I know what Chloe said. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Mom." I held up my hand gently. "No, Daniel, I'd like to hear the answer." Chloe's composure tightened. "We discussed this." "No," I corrected softly. "You announced it." Her jaw flexed. "We're family," she insisted. "Families help each other." "Families," I replied, "also respect boundaries." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mr. Carter cleared his throat. "We don't want to cause trouble." "Then you shouldn't have packed your expectations," I said, still steady. Chloe stepped closer to me, lowering her voice. "You're embarrassing us." I met her gaze evenly. "You embarrassed yourselves when you assumed ownership of something that isn't yours." Daniel finally spoke, frustration bleeding through. "Mom, can we not do this in front of everyone?" "In front of everyone," I echoed softly. "This situation was created in front of everyone." Mrs. Carter's smile had faded. "Are you saying we're not moving in?" There it was, the moment of truth. And for the first time since that Sunday dinner, I felt completely calm because I knew exactly what I was about to say. I looked at Mrs. Carter, then at her husband, and finally at Chloe. My voice did not shake. It did not rise. It stayed exactly where it needed to be. "Yes," I said gently, "that is exactly what I am saying." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Chloe's face drained of color first, then flushed red just as quickly. "You can't be serious," she said under her breath. "I am completely serious." Daniel stepped forward, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, we talked about this." "No," I corrected calmly. "You told me what you planned. That is not the same thing." Mr. Carter shifted awkwardly near the dresser, glancing at his wife. Mrs. Carter looked embarrassed now, her earlier excitement fading into confusion. "Chloe told us it was settled," she said quietly. "I'm sure she did," I replied. Chloe's eyes snapped to mine. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I'm saying," I answered, "that no one asked the homeowner." Daniel exhaled sharply. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I turned to him slowly. "Daniel, harder for whom?" He didn't respond. I walked further into the guest room and rested my hand lightly on the back of the reading chair. This room was designed for visitors, short visits, holidays, weekends. It was never meant to become a permanent residence. Chloe folded her arms. "You live here alone." "Yes." "And you have all this space." "Yes." Her voice sharpened. "So why is this such a big deal?" "Because it's mine." The words burned in my throat, but I did not spit them out with anger. Instead, I let them come slowly. "It is a big deal," I said evenly, "because this house represents my retirement, my security, my peace." Daniel shook his head. "No one's taking that from you." "Moving 2 additional adults into my home permanently changes my life. That is taking something." Chloe let out a short, humorless laugh. "So what, you're just going to leave my parents struggling?" I met her gaze steadily. "Their housing situation is not my responsibility." Her eyes hardened. "We're family." "Yes," I agreed, "and family does not corner someone into surrendering their home." Mrs. Carter touched Chloe's arm. "Maybe we should go." But Chloe wasn't finished. "You're being selfish." There it was, the word designed to wound older mothers, the word that implies we have already taken enough and now should give endlessly. I smiled faintly. After 40 years of giving, I have earned the right to be selective. Daniel's frustration turned to something closer to anger. "Mom, you're acting like we're trying to steal from you." I looked at him quietly. "Aren't you?" His expression faltered. "We weren't asking to sell it, just share it." "For how long?" I asked again. No answer. Chloe avoided the question entirely. "You have legal documents, don't you? You're always so prepared." I raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "I'm just saying," she continued, her voice cool now, "Daniel is your only child. Eventually, this house will be his." Ah, there it was. Not temporary help, future planning. I felt something inside me settle into place, the missing piece of the puzzle. "This house," I said carefully, "is in a trust." Daniel blinked. "A what?" "A trust," I repeated calmly, "established before I retired." Chloe's posture stiffened. "What kind of trust?" "The kind that protects assets from impulsive decisions and external pressures." Daniel stared at me. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" Because it was not necessary. Chloe's jaw clenched. So you're saying Daniel doesn't even own this house? I'm saying, I replied evenly, that ownership is clearly defined. And what exactly does that mean? She pressed. It means, I stepped closer so there could be no misunderstanding, that no one moves into this house without my written permission. Daniel looked stunned. You don't trust me? I trust you, I said softly, but I also understand influence. Chloe took that personally. Are you implying I manipulate him? I am implying, I answered, that you make plans without consulting me. Mrs. Carter cleared her throat again. We truly didn't mean to cause trouble. I nodded toward her kindly. I believe you, but this situation should never have progressed this far. Daniel's voice lowered. Chloe thought you'd agree. That was her mistake. Chloe stepped forward, eyes blazing now. You're humiliating my parents. No, I replied quietly. I am correcting an assumption. The room felt smaller by the second. Daniel looked between us, torn. There has to be a compromise. There is, I said gently. They can visit, they can stay for a weekend, but they cannot move in. Chloe shook her head in disbelief. You'd rather live alone than help family. I prefer to live peacefully. The truth is, I felt a flicker of sadness watching Daniel struggle. I never wanted him in this position, but adulthood requires choices and respect. Chloe finally grabbed her purse from the dresser. Fine, she snapped. We'll figure something else out. Mr. Carter moved toward the door first, clearly eager to escape the tension. Mrs. Carter followed quietly. Daniel lingered. Mom, you could have handled this better. I looked at him long and hard. I handled it calmly. I handled it honestly. I handled it before moving trucks arrived. He had no response. As they walked upstairs, I followed at a measured pace. When we reached the front door, I opened it wide. You are welcome to visit. You are not welcome to move in. Chloe walked past me without another word. Daniel paused briefly, disappointment etched across his face. And then they were gone. The door closed gently behind them. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence return to my house. It felt different now, not fragile, protected. The sound of their cars pulling away echoed longer than it should have. I stood by the window until the second vehicle disappeared past the bend in the road. Only then did I allow myself to exhale fully. The house felt larger somehow. Not emptier, just reclaimed. I walked slowly through the living room, straightening a cushion that hadn't even been disturbed. It wasn't about tidying. It was about reasserting ownership in small, quiet gestures. This was my space, my air, my peace. But peace, I would soon learn, does not always mean silence. Daniel didn't call that evening. He didn't call the next day either. By Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed with a message, not from him. It was Chloe. I think you owe my parents an apology. I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting it face down on the table. An apology for not surrendering my home. I didn't respond. By Wednesday, Daniel finally called. Hi, Mom. His tone was distant, careful. Hello, Daniel. There was a pause, and then he said, Chloe's really upset. I imagine she is. She thinks you embarrassed her in front of her parents. I corrected a misunderstanding. She said you made it sound like she was trying to take advantage of you. I remained quiet for a moment. Daniel, I said gently, were you? He sighed heavily. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? He struggled to answer. She just wants to help her parents, he repeated, and she believed the solution was to move them into a house she does not own. He didn't argue that point. Instead, he changed direction. You didn't tell me about the trust. That's correct. Why? Because, I said calmly, it was never up for negotiation. There was frustration in his breathing now. It makes me feel like you don't trust me with anything. That isn't true, I said softly. I trust you with love, with family, with my heart. But finances and property are responsibilities I've managed my entire adult life. You could have at least told me. I would have, I replied, if you had asked instead of assuming. That silenced him. Then he said something that struck deeper than I expected. Chloe thinks you've never accepted you. That accusation sat heavy in my chest, not because it was true, but because it was complicated. I accepted her as your wife, I said carefully, but acceptance does not mean surrender. She feels like you see her as an outsider. I looked around my living room, the photographs of Daniel growing up, the framed picture from his wedding day where I stood smiling beside Chloe. I had welcomed her. I had hosted holidays. I had given thoughtful gifts. But Chloe didn't want welcome. She wanted access. Daniel, I said gently, there's a difference between being part of the family and controlling the family. His tone sharpened. That's unfair. Is it? He didn't answer immediately. Then came the question I had been waiting for. So what happens now? Now, I said calmly, your in-laws find housing that does not involve my retirement. And if they can't, they will. He was quiet again, wrestling with something I couldn't see through the phone. Before we ended the call, he said, Chloe thinks you're being stubborn. I think I'm being clear. After we hung up, I felt the ache settle in. Not regret, not guilt, but the sadness of watching your child step into a marriage where boundaries blur. That weekend, I drove into town to run errands. I stopped at the grocery store and ran into Mrs. Henderson, an old friend from church. I heard your son was visiting last weekend, she said warmly. Yes, I replied. And Chloe's parents, too? My heart skipped. How did you hear that? She hesitated. Well, Chloe mentioned they were moving in. She seemed very excited. So it had spread. I smiled politely, but inside I felt a slow burn. Chloe hadn't just assumed privately, she had announced it publicly. By the time I reached my car, I understood something important. This wasn't just about housing, it was about narrative. She had already begun crafting one where I was the generous matriarch opening my home to her struggling parents. And now that I had declined, I risked becoming the villain in her version of events. That evening, I received a call I hadn't expected. It was Mr. Carter. Mrs. Reynolds, he said awkwardly. Yes? I wanted to apologize for Saturday. We didn't realize things weren't settled. His voice carried genuine embarrassment. I appreciate that, I said kindly. We never meant to overstep. I know, I replied. There was a pause before he added quietly, Chloe gets determined. Determined. That was one word for it. I wish you and your wife the best in finding a solution, I said sincerely. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and reflected. It would have been easy to soften, to offer a temporary arrangement out of guilt, but I knew how those arrangements end. Temporary becomes extended, extended becomes expected, expected becomes permanent, and permanent would mean losing the life I worked for. Sunday morning arrived calm and bright. I brewed my coffee and stepped onto the porch again. The lake shimmered under the early light. A breeze brushed across the water, carrying that familiar scent of pine and earth. I closed my eyes and listened. No tension, no raised voices, no negotiation, just stillness. I realized then that protecting peace often looks harsh to those who benefit from its sacrifice. My phone buzzed again, a group text from Chloe. Since it's clear we can't rely on family support, we'll handle this ourselves. The implication was obvious. I typed only one response: I wish you well. And I meant it. Because boundaries are not punishments, they are protection, and I had no intention of apologizing for protecting what was mine. The week after that message passed in an uneasy quiet. No calls, no texts from Daniel, no cheerful photos from Chloe about weekend brunches or work promotions. Just silence. Silence can be peaceful when chosen, but when it's imposed, it feels different. It hums under your skin. I tried not to let it disturb me. I kept my routine steady: morning coffee on the dock, an afternoon walk along the shoreline, gardening in the small patch beside the house. I reminded myself that I had raised Daniel to be independent, to build his own life. But independence should never require me to surrender mine. Still, I worried. Not about losing the house, about losing my son. On Thursday evening, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." His voice sounded tired. "Hey, Mom." I could hear traffic in the background. "Are you all right?" I asked. "Yeah, just a lot going on." I waited. "Chloe's parents found a small rental," he said finally. "It's not ideal." "I'm glad they found something," I replied gently. There was a pause. "She thinks you forced this." I let out a slow breath. "Daniel, I didn't force anything. I simply didn't agree. She keeps saying families sacrifice for each other." "And what have I done for the last 40 years?" I asked softly. He didn't answer that. Instead, his tone shifted. "She's been under a lot of stress." "I'm sure she has." "She feels like you don't care about her parents." "I care, but caring does not equal housing." The line went quiet again. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. "She thinks you don't trust her because of the prenup." Ah, there it was, the piece he hadn't known about. "You told her?" I asked. "She found out," he admitted, "when we were talking about finances." "And what did she say?" "That you planned for divorce before we even got married." I closed my eyes briefly. "Daniel, the prenup was your idea." "I know," he said quickly, "but she feels blindsided." "She was informed before the wedding," I reminded him gently. "She signed it willingly." "She says she felt pressured." "Pressed by whom?" I wanted to ask. "By me?" I had barely spoken during those discussions. I had simply ensured that my assets, my home, my savings remained protected. "Daniel," I said carefully, "marriage is not ownership, it is partnership." He sounded frustrated now. "You're making everything sound like she's some kind of threat." "I am responding to behavior, not imagining it." Another silence stretched between us. Finally, he said, "She thinks you'll always see her as the outsider." "I see her as your wife, but when someone attempts to rearrange my life without consent, I respond accordingly." He exhaled slowly. "I just don't want to be stuck in the middle." "You're not," I said gently. "You're choosing your marriage, and that's appropriate." "Are you angry at me?" His vulnerability in his voice softened something in me. "No," I said truthfully. "I'm disappointed in how this was handled, but I am not angry at you." He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "Chloe wants some space." Space. That word again. "I understand." She said maybe we shouldn't visit for a while. The words landed heavier than I expected. "If that's what you both need," I replied calmly. He hesitated before adding, "She feels like you embarrassed her parents." I corrected misinformation, I said quietly. She thinks you could have said no privately. Daniel, I replied gently, they arrived expecting to move in. That was not private. He sighed again. I just want everyone to get along. So do I. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table long after the sun had set. The house felt too quiet that night. I thought about all the times Daniel had run through these rooms as a teenager, slamming doors, laughing too loudly. I thought about how proud I felt watching him marry the woman he loved. I never wanted to compete, but I also refused to be diminished. The following weekend, something unexpected happened. A moving truck drove slowly past my driveway. It wasn't for me. It continued down the road toward another property, but the sight of it made my stomach twist. I imagined what would have happened if I had given in. Boxes stacked in my hallway, furniture rearranged, my routines disrupted. The subtle but constant awareness that I was no longer alone in my sanctuary. Temporary becomes permanent. Permanent becomes resentment. Resentment becomes fracture. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Henderson called. I heard Chloe's parents found a place, she said gently. Yes. She seemed upset about how things unfolded. I imagined she was. Mrs. Henderson paused before asking carefully, Are you all right? I looked out at the water shimmering beyond my window. Yes, I said, I am. And I meant it. Because here is something I have learned. When you stand firm in calm truth, the storm often rages elsewhere. That evening, I received one final message from Chloe. We won't be coming for Thanksgiving this year. No explanation, no warmth, just distance. I typed back a single sentence. The door is always open for visits, not for living arrangements. I didn't add anything else, because boundaries do not require essays. They require consistency. And even if it cost me holidays and silence for a season, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would not surrender my peace to avoid someone else's disappointment.
Thanksgiving came and went quietly. For the first time in years, there was no extra chair at my table. No Daniel carving the turkey the way his father used to. No Chloe rearranging my serving dishes to make them more efficient. Just me, a smaller meal, and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. I set the table for one and still found myself placing out 3 plates before catching the habit. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty settings, then slowly returned 2 of them to the cabinet. Grief doesn't always come from loss of people. Sometimes it comes from the loss of what you thought your future would look like. That afternoon, after washing my single plate, I wrapped myself in a cardigan and walked down to the dock. The air was crisp, the lake reflecting a pale gray sky. I sat at the edge and let my feet dangle above the water. I asked myself the hard question, was it worth it? Was protecting my home worth this distance? The answer didn't come immediately. It arrived slowly, like the steady rhythm of waves against wood. Yes. Because if I had said yes to avoid this temporary loneliness, I would have invited permanent unrest. Still, loneliness has a way of whispering doubts late at night. 2 weeks later, Daniel called unexpectedly. "Mom," he said, his voice strained. "What's wrong?" I asked immediately. "Chloe and I have been arguing." I stayed quiet, allowing him space. "It's about money," he admitted. "Her parents' rent is higher than they expected, and they need help." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. "I'm sorry to hear that." "She thinks if you had just let them stay with you, we wouldn't be dealing with this." Of course she did. "And what do you think?" I asked gently. There was a long pause. "I think it's complicated." I almost smiled at that. "Daniel," I said softly, Helping someone financially is one thing. Moving them into your retirement home without consent is another. She says you're choosing a building over family. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes briefly. No, I said. I'm choosing stability over chaos. He sounded tired. She keeps bringing up the trust, says you're controlling everything from beyond the grave. I let out a slow breath. That trust exists so no one can pressure you into selling this house someday. I wouldn't sell it, he said quickly. Not intentionally, I replied gently, but life changes. Debt happens. Divorce happens. Influence happens. He didn't argue. She says you think she's after your money. I think she's comfortable making plans with it, I answered calmly. That's silence again. Then, quietly, Daniel said something that shifted the tone. Mom, did I mess this up? My heart softened instantly. You didn't mess anything up. You're navigating marriage. It's new. But I should have talked to you before telling her it might work. Yes, I agreed softly. He exhaled. I didn't realize he had already told her parents. I know. There was a tremor in his voice now. She told them they could start packing before she even told me she'd invited them over. That detail landed heavily. You see, I said gently, why I was concerned. He didn't answer directly. She gets very determined, he repeated, echoing his father-in-law's words. Yes, I said quietly, she does. He hesitated before asking, if things ever got really bad, would you still help us? I understood the deeper meaning behind that question. If you needed medical help, emergency support, or temporary shelter because of a crisis, I would never turn my back on you. But not long term? Not without agreement, not without respect. He was quiet for a long moment. I think she thought once we were married, everything automatically became shared. Marriage shares life, not ownership of someone else's labor. He gave a small, humorless laugh. You always say things like that. Because they're true. Another pause. Then he said something that made my chest ache a different way. She said if you loved us, you'd prove it. Ah, emotional leverage. Daniel, I said softly, love is not measured by how much of yourself you surrender. He didn't respond right away. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, I don't want to lose you. Tears pricked my eyes, but my voice stayed steady. You won't. I just feel like I'm constantly choosing. You are, I said gently. That's adulthood. He breathed slowly on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, I need time to sort things out. Take it, I replied. After we hung up, I sat by the window watching dusk settle over the lake. The sky turned lavender, then deep blue. Lights flickered on in distant houses across the water. I realized something important that evening. Chloe wasn't angry because I embarrassed her. She was angry because I disrupted her plan. And plans built without consent often collapse loudly. But I also saw something else. Daniel was beginning to notice the pattern. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to question. Boundaries do not always change people immediately. Sometimes they simply reveal who they are. And as I sat there in the quiet I fought to protect, I knew this story was far from over. Because pressure has a way of building, and when it does, something always gives. December arrived with the kind of sharp cold that makes everything feel more exposed. The trees around the lake stood bare, their branches thin against the pale sky. I had decorated the house modestly for Christmas. White lights along the porch railing, a wreath on the door, a small tree in the corner of the living room. Not the grand displays I used to put up when Daniel was young, just enough to make the house feel warm. I didn't know if he would come. We hadn't spoken in nearly 2 weeks after that last phone call. I didn't reach out. I wanted him to think clearly without feeling pulled. On the second Sunday of December, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, Daniel stood there alone. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to run into my arms after school. His shoulders were tense now, his expression worn. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart," I said softly, stepping aside. "Come in." The house felt instantly different with him inside. He removed his coat slowly, glancing around like he was reacquainting himself with the space. "It looks nice," he said quietly, noticing the tree. "Thank you." We sat at the kitchen table. I poured him coffee without asking, still remembering exactly how he takes it. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things: work, the weather, traffic. Then the silence between us grew heavier. "She didn't want me to come," he said finally. I didn't react outwardly. "I see. She thinks I'm choosing sides." "And what do you think you're doing?" I asked gently. He stared down at his hands. "I don't know anymore." I let him sit with that. "She's still angry," he continued, "about the house, about the trust, about everything." "Is she angry at me?" I asked carefully, "or at losing control?" He flinched slightly at that word. "She says you humiliated her." I replied calmly. "I corrected her." He rubbed his temples. "She told her parents they could move in before we even discussed it properly." I waited. "And when I pushed back," he said quietly, "she accused me of not supporting her." "That must have been difficult," I said softly. He nodded. "She says marriage means standing united." I agreed, but unity built on pressure doesn't last. He looked at me then, really looked at me. "Did you ever feel like Dad pressured you?" The question surprised me. "No," I said honestly. "Your father and I disagreed plenty, but we never cornered each other." Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "She keeps bringing up our finances," he admitted. "Says you're sitting on a house that could solve problems." "And whose problems are those?" I asked gently. He didn't answer. "Daniel," I continued softly, "has she asked you to contribute more financially to her parents?" His silence told me everything. "Yes," he said eventually. "We've been sending them money." "How much?" He hesitated. "More than we can comfortably afford." There it was, the real strain. "And when you expressed concern," I asked, "she said I was being selfish." That word again. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. Providing support is generous, but it should never destabilize your own household. He looked exhausted. "She says if I loved her, I'd prioritize her family." "You can prioritize without surrendering," I replied. He swallowed hard. "Sometimes I feel like nothing I do is enough." My heart tightened. "Daniel," I said gently, "marriage should not feel like a constant test." He sat quietly for a long moment. Then he said something that shifted everything. "She asked if we could challenge the trust." The words hung in the air between us. "Challenge it?" I repeated softly. "She thinks if we argue that you're being influenced or not in your right mind." He stopped himself. I felt a cold stillness settle over me. "She suggested declaring me mentally unstable," I asked evenly. His eyes filled with guilt. I told her no immediately, but she said it was just an option. An option. To declare me incompetent so they could access my home. I withdrew my hand slowly and folded it in my lap. My voice, when I spoke, remained calm. Thank you for telling me. I didn't agree with her, he said quickly. I swear. I believe you. He looked shaken now. I didn't realize how far she was thinking. I nodded slowly. You see why I protected myself, I said gently. He nodded back, his eyes glossy. I don't know what to do, he whispered. I wanted to pull him into an embrace like I did when he was small, but he wasn't small anymore, and this wasn't a scraped knee. Daniel, I said gently, you must decide what kind of partnership you want. He wiped at his eyes quickly, embarrassed. I didn't marry her for this. I know. We sat in silence for a while, the Christmas lights glowing softly in the corner. I'm scared, he admitted. Of what? Of that if I keep pushing back, she'll leave. The fear in his voice broke my heart. And if you stop pushing back, I asked gently. He understood. I'll lose myself, he said quietly. Yes, that was the choice. He stayed for another hour. We didn't solve everything, but something important had shifted. When he stood to leave, he hugged me tightly. I'm sorry, he murmured. For what? I asked softly. For not seeing it sooner. I kissed his cheek. Growth takes time. As I watched him drive away, I realized this was no longer about a lake house. It was about boundaries revealing truth, and truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. Inside the house, the Christmas lights continued to glow, but beneath their warmth, I sensed the storm gathering. Because if Chloe had suggested challenging my mental stability, she wasn't finished fighting, and neither was I.
After Daniel left that afternoon, I did not panic. I did not cry. I did not call a lawyer in a frenzy. Instead, I made tea. There is something about deliberate calm that unsettles people who expect chaos. I sat at my kitchen table and replayed his words carefully. Challenge the trust, claim I was influenced, suggest I was not in my right mind. It was bold, but more than that, it was revealing. You don't threaten someone's competence unless you believe their resistance is permanent. By evening, I made 3 quiet decisions. First, I called my attorney the next morning. Second, I scheduled a full medical evaluation, completely voluntary. Third, I installed exterior and interior security cameras covering all entrances and shared areas of the home. Not because I was afraid, because documentation is protection. My attorney, Mr. Whitaker, had helped me establish the trust years ago. When I explained the situation calmly, he didn't sound surprised. Family disputes over property are common, he said evenly, but challenging a trust on the basis of incompetence requires evidence. I'm not incompetent, I replied quietly. I'm aware, he said gently, but accusations can still be made. He advised me to document all communication moving forward, keep texts, record dates of visits, maintain medical records. Preparation is not aggression, it is wisdom. The medical evaluation was almost amusing in its thoroughness. Cognitive tests, memory recall, neurological assessment. When the doctor smiled and said, "You're sharper than most people 20 years younger," I felt an unexpected wave of relief. Not because I doubted myself, but because I knew paper silences rumors. The cameras were installed discreetly, small, unobtrusive, visible enough to discourage nonsense, invisible enough not to feel invasive. Then I waited, and the call came sooner than expected. 3 days before Christmas. Daniel's voice sounded tight. "Mom, Chloe wants to come by." "Is there a reason?" I asked calmly. "She says she wants to clear the air." Clear the air. "I'm open to conversation," I said calmly. "You're both welcome to visit." He hesitated. She may bring her parents. I paused for a moment. For a conversation, I said evenly, not a relocation. Yes, he replied quickly, just a conversation. They arrived on Christmas Eve afternoon. Chloe stepped out of the car with purpose in her stride. Her parents followed more cautiously this time. Daniel looked caught in the middle again. I opened the door before they knocked. "Merry Christmas," I said warmly. Chloe's smile was tight. "Merry Christmas." We sat in the living room. The tree lights flickered softly beside us. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Chloe began. "I think this has gotten out of hand," she said smoothly. "In what way?" I asked gently. "There's been misunderstanding." I waited. "My parents never meant to impose." "I believe that," I replied. She nodded, as if that settled something. "Good. So perhaps we can move forward." "Of course," I said calmly. She folded her hands. "We just feel hurt. The way everything unfolded made it seem like we were opportunistic." I met her gaze. "You arrived expecting to move into my home without written agreement." Her jaw tightened slightly. "We thought it was implied." "Implied by whom?" Silence. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Chloe continued, changing tactics. "Daniel is your only child. Eventually, this house will be his." "Eventually," I agreed. "So what's the harm in letting us start building equity as a family now?" There it was. Not temporary help, future positioning. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "This house," I said evenly, "is not an investment vehicle." Her tone sharpened. "You're holding on to control." "Yes," I said simply, "I am." That startled her. "You admit that?" she pressed. "I do," I replied, "because control over one's own property is appropriate." Her father cleared his throat softly. "We don't want trouble." "I don't either," I said kindly. Chloe exhaled sharply. "We just want fairness." "Fairness," I repeated gently, "does not mean access." Her eyes flashed. "So you'll never help us?" "I have helped. I raised my son to be capable." The room went quiet again. Then Chloe said something that told me everything I needed to know. "We consulted someone," she said carefully, "about the trust." Daniel's head snapped toward her. "Chloe!" "It's fine," I said softly. "Continue." She lifted her chin. "We were told trust can be challenged." "They can," I replied evenly. Her confidence flickered. "But," I added calmly, "they require credible evidence of coercion or incompetence." Silence. I let it linger. "I've completed a full medical evaluation this week. My cognitive health is excellent. I've also updated documentation with my attorney." Daniel stared at me. Chloe's expression changed just slightly. "And," I finished softly, "this property is protected not only by trust, but by explicit succession conditions." "What conditions?" she demanded. "Conditions that ensure it cannot be transferred, sold, or occupied without clear consent during my lifetime." Her mask slipped then. "You don't trust us at all," she said quietly. I held her gaze. "I trust behavior." Daniel looked between us, realization dawning. Chloe stood abruptly. "So that's it. You've locked everything down." "Yes," I said calmly. "I have." The room felt smaller. Her mother shifted nervously. "Chloe, maybe we should—" But Chloe was already moving toward the door. "You've made your position clear." "I have," I agreed. Daniel remained seated for a moment longer. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something new. Not anger, not confusion, understanding. When they left, the house fell silent once more. But this time the silence felt final, because protection is not cruelty, and clarity is not hostility. It is simply strength expressed without shouting. And as I stood by the window watching their car disappear into the winter dusk, I knew one thing with certainty. The storm had broken. What came next would not be negotiation. It would be consequence.
After they drove away on Christmas Eve, I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from standing your ground with people you love. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like survival. Christmas morning arrived quietly. I woke early, more out of habit than excitement, and walked into the living room. The tree lights glowed softly in the dim light. I sat on the couch with a blanket around my shoulders and let myself feel everything I had been holding back. I loved my son. That had never changed. But love without boundaries is not devotion. It is surrender. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Can I come by?" I didn't hesitate. Of course. He arrived alone again. His face looked different this time. Not just tired, clear. We sat at the kitchen table like we had weeks earlier, but something had shifted. He wasn't hunched or defensive. He looked resolved. "I told her I won't challenge the trust," he said immediately. I nodded once. She was furious. I imagined she would be. "She said you've turned me against her." I held his gaze gently. "Have I?" He shook his head slowly. "No." The word felt like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. He continued, "I've been thinking about how this started." I let him speak. "She told her parents they were moving in before she told me. She announced it publicly. She framed it like you had already agreed." "Yes," I said softly. "And when you said no, she called you selfish." "Yes." "And when I questioned her, she said I wasn't being a good husband." I didn't interrupt. He looked down at his hands. "I realized something, Mom." I waited. "If I had convinced you to let them move in, it wouldn't have stopped there." "No, it wouldn't have." "She sees your house as part of our future assets," he said carefully, "not as your present peace." That sentence alone told me he had finally seen the difference. "I never wanted to choose between you," he continued, "but I think I've been choosing comfort over clarity." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Marriage is not about surrendering your judgment," I said gently. He nodded. "She gave me an ultimatum last night," he admitted quietly. My heart tightened. "What kind?" "She said if I didn't stand fully with her, including challenging the trust, then maybe we weren't aligned long term." I absorbed that. "And what did you say?" He swallowed hard. "I told her I won't attack my mother to prove loyalty." Tears pricked my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. That was brave. He shook his head slowly. It felt terrifying. Boundaries often do. He leaned back in his chair. "She left this morning, went to stay with her parents." The weight of that settled heavily between us. "I'm not sure what happens next," he said. "Sometimes," I replied softly, "what happens next depends on who is willing to compromise." He gave a sad smile. "I'm willing to compromise. I'm not willing to manipulate." That was growth. Real growth. The kind that hurts. We spent the afternoon talking, not about property, not about trusts, but about values, about what partnership means, about respect, about how love cannot be proven through destruction. When he stood to leave, he hugged me tightly again. "I don't know where this ends," he whispered. "Wherever it ends, you will still have a mother." Weeks passed. Chloe did not return to the lake house. Daniel focused on work, on counseling, something he chose voluntarily. He told me later that the counselor asked him a simple question that echoed everything we had lived through. "Why did your wife feel entitled to something that wasn't hers?" He said that question lingered in the room longer than any argument ever had. Eventually, Chloe reached out. not to demand, not to accuse, but to talk. The tone had changed, not warm, but less sharp. I agreed to meet at a cafe in town. She arrived looking smaller somehow, less polished, more human. I pushed too hard, she admitted quietly. I didn't interrupt. When I grew up, I watched my parents struggle, she continued. I promised myself I'd never let them feel unstable again. I understand that, I said gently. But I treated your house as a solution instead of your life. That was the first time she had acknowledged it clearly. I won't challenge the trust, she added. I was angry. Anger explains behavior. It does not excuse it. I appreciate you saying that, I replied. We did not become close that afternoon, but something fragile and necessary formed: understanding. Months later, Daniel and Chloe were still working through their marriage, slower now, more aware. Her parents remained in their rental, and my lake house remained exactly what it was meant to be: mine, peaceful, protected. I still sit on the dock most mornings with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the water. Sometimes Daniel joins me, sometimes he doesn't, but there is no longer tension attached to this place, no whispered plans, no assumptions, just boundaries that held. Here is what I learned. People who call you selfish for protecting your peace are often uncomfortable with losing access to it. Family is not ownership, marriage is not entitlement, and love does not require you to hand over the keys to your sanctuary. The day my daughter-in-law tried to move her parents into my lake house, she believed I would fold to avoid conflict. Instead, I chose calm strength. And sometimes the most powerful word you can say is no.